Well, we've been talking about heaven and earth and how they interact, and then we started a little bit to just think about Pentecost,
Yes.
the day of Pentecost, the famous passage in Acts 2, which is obviously a fulfillment of the feast of Pentecost, but it's also a fulfillment of this idea that's tied to the temple story and heaven and earth, which starts in Eden and creation. So, talk a little bit about Pentecost, Dad, and how all those ideas kind of tie together in.
Okay. Well, basically, when we talk about these things, I guess our mindset, whether it be the Western mindset or whatever, we want to pigeonhole things and separate them. But God is writing a story,
Yeah,
and you just don't take one chapter
right.
and settle there. You're not going to get the whole story.
That's really good.
Well, when it comes to what we're talking about, heaven and earth, we mentioned that at the ascension, Jesus went up to the Father, and the Father approved of Jesus' word. And the Father has made several promises, according to the Scriptures. He said He's going to send the Spirit, and that's part of the promise of the Father. Well, we know that that happened on the day of Pentecost. And so what you have, a heaven deposit coming to earth in the Spirit, pouring out His Spirit upon the disciples, because the Spirit was going to equip them. And the major thing about the life in the Spirit is a lot of people are afraid of it for several reasons, but the major reason that the Spirit has been given is that He might furnish this temple. He might give you all that you need so that you can live the overcoming life.
Okay.
And so what do? We need to go back to Jesus. Jesus was saved because He was conceived by the Spirit, and certainly had no sin within Him.
Yeah.
So He went up to the Father and came back. But before He left, He said, there's going to come a time, boys, that I'm going to baptize you, or the Father's going to send His gift, or however you want to term it.
Right.
And there are many different ways of saying it in Luke's Gospel especially,
Yeah.
that I'm going to send the Spirit. And that's the promise of the Father. And when you receive that Spirit will enable you to become,
Okay.
so that you become a fully developed human being. Because you're fully developed when the Spirit is in you, but that's not enough. We get the Spirit within us when we get saved. Romans 8:9, you don't have the Spirit, then you're none of His. But you are born of the Spirit. Jesus taught this to Nicodemus.
Yeah.
He said, Nick, you got to be reborn again. Well, Nick says, well, how in the world do I do that? Well, you got to be born of the of water and the Spirit.
Okay.
So that's a salvation experience.
Right.
And the disciples really received that salvation experience when on the resurrection day, He visited the disciples who were all bundled up in the room, and He mysteriously entered the room,
Yeah.
and then He breathed on them and said, receive the Spirit.
Okay.
That was their new birth experience.
Yeah.
That's where the heaven and the presence of heaven
Right.
came and indwelt them.
Right.
Now that's hard to wrap your mind around. I can't figure it all out.
Yeah.
How heaven can be in me, but I just have to, by faith, accept God is in me.
Yeah.
And if God is in me, then I don't have part of God or just an aspect of God or His head of God or foot of God. I have all of God. And Paul picks this up in Ephesians. Ephesians 3, you're to be filled with the fullness of Christ. Ephesians 4, you're to be filled with the fullness of God. In Ephesians 5, he tells you to be filled with the Spirit.
Okay. It's good. Yeah.
And Jesus thought it was so important. He said, boys, don't you leave Jerusalem until you go there and receive the promise of the Father.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they were obedient, and it mysteriously fell. And that began to equip them for the assignment. Now I want to pause it for a minute and stress the emphasis of being. The being is not necessarily to do the works of power.
Okay.
Back in the Gospels, Jesus said, all authority and power I'm giving it to you.
Right.
So you can go and do the works of power.
Okay.
The authority gives you the works of power. And the word there is exousia, a little Greek word.
Right.
But when you come to Acts 1:8, the word is dunamis.
Okay.
And it's the power of God in you to become.
Wow. Yeah.
You're a man or woman of being.
Yeah.
And you must become a human being.
Wow. That's good.
He didn't give that to you so you could be a human doing.
Yeah.
He wants you to be a human being.
Right.
Why? Because he's chosen you, chosen me, chosen every one of us to reflect the image of the Father.
Right. Right. I love
And
that.
we are image bearers, and we are to bear his image in every aspect of life.
And that's so important because I think we talked about this before, but Jesus is the true human being.
Yes.
He shows us how to be human, which means to perfectly reflect what God is like, the image and the heart of the Father. And we can really only be human or new creation human beings and become the fulfillment of that. We can only do that in Jesus and by the Spirit.
That's right. That's right.
So that's why salvation and being incorporated into Jesus, but also Pentecost, operating in the power of the Spirit, are what allow us or empower us to live a Jesus life.
Right.
And a Jesus life may include signs and wonders and miracles, but it's really about who we become.
That's
that
right.
we become this
Sons of
embodiment,
God.
this reflection to the world, just like Jesus was. And I think that's a huge shift. That's a really good.
Well, Jesus spent all of his life teaching the disciples how to be, especially Sermon on the Mount.
Yeah.
Totally contrary to the ethics and the ways of the world.
Okay.
Sermon on the Mount.
Yeah, yeah.
And then Paul picks it up, as you know, in all of his letters and writing.
Yeah.
So the whole emphasis, basically, of the New Testament is this becoming. Paul says, man, I'm working, I'm laboring, doing all I can that Christ be formed in you.
Yeah. Right.
And that's the being dimension of our life and experience. And that's the great thing of Pentecost. Now, we can talk about tongues and the meaning about that, but
Right.
I want everyone to realize tongues are important, but they're not the most important.
Okay.
And tongues may be a sign that you have an experience with the Spirit. But as I tell my students over and over again, you speak in tongues, so what?
Right.
Is it making any difference in your life so that you're becoming
Yeah.
more like Christ?
So good.
Are you listening to the promptings of the Spirit? You shouldn't say that.
Yeah.
You don't need to go there. You don't need to watch this.
Right.
You need to help me with that anger problem,
Yeah.
that lust problem, or whatever else.
Right. So it has so much to do with surrendering, because when you were talking about you can't get your mind around how heaven, you're full of it, or it enters you. Heaven, Jesus talked about heaven. When he talked about heaven, he always talked about the kingdom of heaven.
Right.
So heaven is a place where God is ruling and reigning.
God reigns, yep.
Where God's will is being done. That's what heaven is. And so what was so magnificent about Jesus is that he was fully surrendered to the will of the Father. And so that was a place where heaven could freely manifest God's will, God's rule, God's reign.
Yeah.
And so when you think about Acts 1:8, you will receive power from on high, and you shall be my witnesses.
That's right.
So in a lot of Pentecostal circles, which we grew up in, the power was to do. We always focused on that.
Yeah.
But it's the emphasis is on that you become this person that, like you said, you pay attention to the promptings, you pay attention, and you're constantly surrendering to not your will but God's, and that's when heaven is manifesting or heaven's coming.
Right.
Yeah.
And see, basically, Jesus called us and he said, follow me.
Okay. Yeah.
Some people will follow him and get saved, but then they won't follow any further.
Right.
Some people follow him and get maybe water baptized or have another experience. But Jesus said, follow me, and follow me right through until I can give you the fullness of God. And you experience that.
Yeah.
And you experience that by going through Jerusalem, spending some time to receive the promise of the Father, and let the Father just begin to work in you, and He'll radically transform you.
Wow. Wow.
And you move from glory to glory,
Yeah.
image to image, as you keep your eyes on Him.
Right.
Now, you mentioned a little bit about surrender.
Mm-hmm.
I like to shift that a little bit. I read it in my devotions this morning.
Okay.
Don't stress surrender. It looks like going out to war and you beat somebody down and you tackle them and you maim them and bring them back.
Yeah.
No, the surrender is not looking at that, but looking at what you're going to behold.
Okay.
As you behold Him, and it's easy to surrender when you behold the glory, when you behold the beauty,
Yeah, I like
behold the purpose, behold the fact He's coming again, behold
really
we're
good.
going to rule this world, we're going to judge this world.
Yeah.
Behold, the whole world is the earth.
Hmm.
They're being destroyed now, but I'm looking forward to when the time God's going to renew it
Uh-huh.
and restore it even better than Genesis.
I like that. I like that. So it's really more getting a glimpse of the beauty, the glory, the majesty of who God is
Yes.
in Jesus, and then, like you said, we just let go because of that.
Yeah.
Because we're captured by that.
All this
And-
stuff doesn't matter anymore.
Yeah, it's really good.